I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I want to welcome you to our first plenary, although it's called Plenary 2 because after our welcome with Bishop Katoto. This is Human Trafficking and Exploitation of Minors. I'll be the moderator for your session. My name is Derek Marsh. I am the Associate Director of the Global Center for Women and Justice. I'll be with you throughout the workshop. I would ask you that you all keep yourselves muted throughout the workshop out of courtesy for our speakers, just so that we can make sure that they are uninterrupted throughout their presentations. This is a 1-hour workshop, so each speaker will have approximately 15 minutes to speak, and at the end of that time, we will have approximately 10 to 15 minutes for questions and answers. Those of you who would like to have questions and answers, there is a Q&A button at the lower right of your screen. Please put those questions there, and I'll be sure to ask those questions of our panelists at the end of the session. If you are taking this for CEUs, continuing education units, please put your full name, affiliation, at an email in your chat now, and we will make sure that we can mark that down for your CEUs. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please put that in chat, and we'll do our best to accommodate your technical difficulties. We did have something earlier about sound. We've done the best we can with sound on our end. You have to work with sound on your end. So please just make sure that you've selected the correct devices on your end to get the best sound you can. Also, we would ask that as we set up the recording, if you do not want you don't want your face to be recorded, then we ask you to turn off your video now so you don't get your face recorded. With that in mind, I want to turn this over to our speakers. We have 3 speakers that have taken the time out of their busy schedules to be with us today. We have Pam Kahn, who is a coordinator for health and wellness with the Orange County Department of Education. Nicole Stratman, who's a CSEC coordinator for the Orange County Social Services Agency, and Dr. Corey Rude, who is a medical director for child abuse pediatrics with the Department of Pediatrics at UCI. And he has also a number of other titles, which I'm sure he'll share with you or not at his discretion. But I'm going to turn the discussion over now to Pam Kahn, please.
Good morning, everybody. It's a mixed blessing today to see you all here because I so much love coming to Vanguard and meeting you all in person and being able to have that interaction. But the beauty of virtual meetings is that we get so many more people to join us, which is good for all of you who maybe couldn't be able to travel and be with us today. So welcome again, and thank you for having me and spending the morning with us. And we hope to come away from this a little more knowledgeable, a little more empathetic, and a little more skilled in how to handle our victims of human trafficking. So with that, let me start, and I'm going to talk about human trafficking from the educational point of view. So let's get going here. Let me share my screen. Okay, give me a second. Slideshow for beginning. Okay, there we go. You guys okay? Everything looks good? You can see it? Good, I got a thumbs up. Okay, let me minimize this. There we go. All right, so human trafficking in the educational system. And as Derek said, my name is Pamela Kahn. I am a registered nurse. My official title is Coordinator of Health and Wellness at the Orange County Department of Education. And in that capacity, I work with all of the school districts in Orange County in their areas of school nursing and school health services. And obviously the nurses, as you probably have all read many times, nursing is one of the most trusted professions in America consistently through the decades. And that's true of the nurses in the school setting. So the nurses in the school setting often have an advantage with our students in that we are not disciplinarians. We do not grade them. We are there merely to help, comfort, and nurture them. So nurses have a unique connection to students in the school setting that oftentimes other administration and staff may not have. And as such, we are privy to a lot of the details of their lives that they may not share with other administrators or school staff. So we're in a unique position and a very lucky position. You may see this, I don't know if anyone else is going to pop this up. This is the latest data I could find on 2017 and 2018 victim demographics of trafficking in Orange County. And this is from Waymakers on Our Salvation Army. And it's broken down by age, gender, and race and ethnicity. So you can take a look at this at your leisure when we get the slides if you're really interested in it. But I'm going to concentrate primarily on the minors that were trafficked in those years, because those are the population that we're going to be seeing in the school setting. So here's a graph, and this is from the same data set that I just showed. So in 2017 and 2018, in Orange County, we had 112 minors that we know of. Obviously, there could have been more that we didn't know, that were victims of human trafficking. Overall, minors were 27% of total victims. So a little over 1/4 of all of the victims trafficked in Orange County were minors. And you can see the pie chart here. So between ages 12 to 15, 9% were those ages, and 18% of those trafficked were 16 to 17 years old. And that's totally our demographic. That'll start about 7th grade and take us all the way through 12th grade. So it's a substantial portion when you look at all the ages, I mean, that's a small portion of ages of people, but it's quite a large portion of victims trafficked. So it's an important thing that we need to be aware of in the school setting. This I found was very interesting. This is a piece of data, a pie chart that shows the minor victims and what their system status is. And that means how have they been involved in the system, our welfare system, our legal system, et cetera. So we've got something that's down here. You can read the text, but the last line I find very, very telling and very helpful to us in identifying, although we can't always count on this. But in this year, 100% of minors identified by the task force investigators had a child welfare history. So everyone that we found, every minor that we were aware of that were either labor trafficked or sexually trafficked, and usually it was more sexual trafficking, and you can look back at that graph that I showed earlier and see that, 100% of them had some involvement with the system. Again, I don't want to make that a criterion to say, well, they're not involved in the system, it's probably not going to happen, but if they have been involved in the system as being taken out of the home, as having interventions by, our child welfare people, be aware. Your radar needs to go up because, of course, those are our more vulnerable children and more likely to be taken advantage of in that sense. So I found that a very interesting statistic. So obviously we know, how can we prevent it? What we really want to do is prevent this from happening. So preventing child trafficking in the educational system. We certainly are aware that certain systemic factors will heighten the risk of students when their vulnerability. And we call those upstream factors because those are before it comes down to us. These are upstream means things that we could treat and intervene in before this happens. Downstream would be obviously treatment after things have happened. So what we look for upstream factors include domestic violence. These are the predominant things that we see in the lives of these minors that have been trafficked. They have had histories of domestic violence, either perpetrated upon themselves or they're witness to it. That's one of the, and I'm going to talk about this later in my session this afternoon, witnessing domestic violence is one of our adverse childhood events that we watch and calculate as to, we create a whole system where we calculate how many adverse childhood events a child has, which increases their risk of behavioral issues, health issues, and later in life, et cetera. So domestic violence is a big one, as I say, either perpetrated upon them or sibling to sibling or witnessing it with parents. Another problem that we know can lead to vulnerability for trafficking is substance abuse. And again, either that substance abuse by the student, the minor themselves, or substance abuse in the home, a parent who is drug addicted or an alcoholic, not functioning, et cetera. We worry about that. And poverty. Poverty makes a student more vulnerable. Traffickers promise a lot to these students, these young people who may not have a lot in their lives. I know that we have seen these girls come in with their nails done and fancy purses and, pretty hip, up-to-date clothes that that they normally would not have been coming in with. And all of a sudden that's an uptick. Or cell phones. If they don't have a lot and they are promised a lot, and that's a lure to them. We have to be, we have to face that and understand that. So we notice these upstream factors, and when you know that a kid is involved in this kind of situation, please keep an eye out. These are indicators that this child may be vulnerable to becoming taken advantage of by traffickers. And if we are able to identify and address these factors, we may be able to reduce the number of students who become involved because we may be able to educate, We may be able to intervene and provide distractions, so to say, or meaning and goals in their life that may make them not as possible moving towards the trafficking area. If we can engage them in another activity or engage them in belonging and create a positive relationship with adults, that can certainly help reduce their risk of becoming trafficked in our school setting. This is an interesting program because it parallels what we do in schools right now. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services has created a framework for trafficking prevention, and it's specifically about what schools can do to prevent, and that's the downstream that I told you, interrupt and help students heal from trafficking. And they've divided these interventions into tiers. And I'll explain what these are briefly, and we'll talk about them in the next few slides. So you see it's sort of a pyramid shape. So the bottom pyramid is the primary tier. The bottom of the pyramid is primary. That's the most effective, the largest group. And those are what we call universal precautions that we can use on every child, or universal interventions rather, that we can use with every student. Any student benefits from learning about what trafficking is, learning about how to watch for it, learning about how not to become vulnerable to it, etc. The secondary tier is for those who possibly have been trafficked or in the process, have experienced it, et cetera. They're going to have a different set of interventions than just your whole universal group that we need to educate and provide skills to. Secondary tier, we need to intervene, and we probably have to do a little more intensive type therapy and treatment for those students. The tertiary tier will be our smallest group, but the group that requires the most effort, because these are the children who have been, or the minors who have been through this, who are suffering from it, who may have physical, emotional, social, behavioral, all of those sequelae or results from being part of a trafficking experience. So the pyramid, as it looks, we have broad interventions for everyone, interventions for a smaller subset, and then the tertiary, the most intensive, go towards the most needy kids who need the most intensive care. Now, we also have a program at the Orange County Department of Education, and I have put it in the resources, called MTSS, which means multi-tiered systems of support. And this system is very much like this. The pyramid looks almost identical to it. And that is a pyramid to create social, emotional, school climate, all of that wellness in our children, to create healthy children, socially, emotionally, behaviorally. And it's the same sort of pyramid. We have universal interventions for that, for creating social and emotional wellness. Secondary interventions for children who may be, suffering some and having some difficulties either at home or at school. And then our tertiary tier for MTSS, which are our children who have severe behavioral issues, have struggling in school, and we put the most intensive efforts into those children, of course. So these two kind of programs mirror each other. It's the same principle, really, of providing, increasing intervention and treatment as the need goes forward. So let's talk about what the primary, the bottom of the pyramid, the most universal prevention strategies would be. Strengthen and create healthy relationships, extremely important. Girls particularly need to know what are healthy relationships, because we know young girls are very vulnerable to, feeling loved and not understanding what healthy boundaries are, et cetera. So strengthening and creating healthy relationships is one of the things that we are very big on in the MTSS, and defining what a healthy relationship is, how to create boundaries, how to say no, et cetera. Teaching social emotional skills. Again, understanding yourself, understanding what you're comfortable with, understanding how to say no, how not to get involved into situations that are uncomfortable for you, and how to relate to each other in a positive way. When there is conflict, how to deal with conflict, et cetera. We want to create a safe school climate, and we do surveys all of the time in the Department of Ed with our school districts and the state does as well, to have student input on how safe do they feel at school, how engaged do they feel, and then we act on those results as they come in. We try to build relationships between schools and community behavioral health providers. We have a new program in the Orange County Department of Ed where we have recently employed, I think, 7 or 8 mental health experts who work specifically with districts on how to connect them with programs that we have available for children, and also what is available out in the community. So again, primary prevention provides the opportunity to change the most for the largest number of students. And everybody benefits from these strategies. Secondary tier strategies are when we are getting to the point of identifying and responding to suspicions of human trafficking. When we think something might have been happening, we start moving into a little more intensive strategy. And this includes training school staff in basic child trafficking prevalence, its dynamics, its risk factors, and indicators. And annually, school staff need to undergo training in child abuse. And this is one of the things that we are starting to see incorporated more in those trainings, is how to recognize what might be indicating that a child is being trafficked. And we also work on intensively training, providing a little extra training to those that are highly connected to students. For example, the front desk staff who see the kids all the time, bus drivers who quite often become friends to those students, they pick them up every day. Our school counselors, our social workers, our attendance officers are particularly important because they know when the kids aren't coming in. I had a nurse tell me just the other day that she remembers a student, and this is one of the signs we watch for, every Friday and every Monday was absent, because we know those are kids that have likely been taken out for the weekend, taken away to Vegas, up to Oakland, wherever the events are happening. And so the attendance officers are very important to have an understanding of what to look for and what are indicators this might be happening. And of course, as I mentioned, our school nurses. So we train those to even a higher degree, special trainings of them for that group to help them identify and who to alert and how to respond to suspicions of child trafficking. And lastly, our tertiary tier, which indicates or includes treatment, recovery, and reintegration. And during this, we provide ongoing social, emotional, and health services, and we coordinate with community providers when it's needed. We can only do so much in the schools, and a lot of children are going to need much more intensive care, both physically and emotionally and behaviorally, than we can provide. So we do what we can in the schools, and we connect outward with our community, Western youth services, et cetera, when we need that kind of help with a student. And we ensure that school behavioral issues are addressed from a trauma-informed perspective. In other words, and I do a lot of education on this, we want school staff to look at a child if they're having trouble with a student, instead of saying to the student, hey, what's wrong with you? Why are you behaving this way? Maybe look at that student and say, what happened to you? Approach them from that mindset, because behaviors occur for a reason. And oftentimes what we think is a maladaptive behavior, we need to understand in the school setting, we need to understand that that behavior might be how they survive outside of the school setting. That's what gets them through a difficult home life, that's what gets them through the trafficking, behaviors that, you know, if a girl is overtly sexual, we would say, hey, that's not really appropriate in the school setting, but that might get her where she needs to be in the trafficking arena. Or a child completely shuts down and withdraws, we're like, what's going on with you? Why aren't you participating in class? Well, maybe that's the way that child survives and escapes notice and beatings and abuse at home. So we need to be able to change our perspective with our administrators and our school staff to have a what happened to you perspective rather than a what's wrong with you perspective. And we also like to provide educational settings that allow, obviously, for our best academic performance, because that's really what our goal is. I mean, we're a wraparound services at school. We understand that education will not happen without health, emotional health, physical health, behavioral health, food security, all of that in place. But ultimately, our goal is to provide kids with the maximum educational achievement they can get. So we have to look at our student-teacher ratios, particularly when you're dealing with children who have been severely traumatized. We may want to put them in a smaller setting, like we have our access schools department, and other schools have those too, and those are for our kids who have gotten way behind in credits or don't do that well in a large setting. We may need to consider that for some children. They might do better with a smaller, more individualized education. Specialized support staff available to students, as I just mentioned. We have hired those mental health experts that work with our districts, but we also need to understand that we need staff on the school site. We need nurses, we need social workers, and we need counselors. And oftentimes our counselors in schools are educational counselors, not the counselors like you would think of as psychotherapy or, you know, talk therapy counselors. So we need to really prioritize where our funding goes and make sure that support staff are available to students. And that's not just for trafficked students, that's for all of our students. We're all under stress and we're all struggling, particularly in this last year. So we need to be very aware of the supports that are needed in the school setting. And of course, coordination with community partners, as I mentioned earlier, is paramount. We cannot do it all in the school setting. We do the best job that we can, but we are all linked in this community. We are all important, and nothing will work unless we're all supporting these students as a whole. The cities need to support the students, the counties need to support the students, and the schools need to support the students. And we have partnerships in the Department of Ed with many, we have a healthcare agency department, collaborations, children's hospital collaborations, social service agency. All of that is important because none of us can do this alone. Here are some resources for some things that I've talked about. There is a great document, and it was put out by the Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education, Human Trafficking in America's Schools. And then the Orangewood Foundation locally put out a 2019 Human Trafficking Victim Report, and then all of our Orange County Department of Ed resources are there with what I've talked about today. So hopefully that gave you a little insight as to what we've got going in the school setting, and please feel free to investigate more with these links. Thank you for your time. Let me stop sharing, or maybe Claire can get me to stop sharing.
I think she did. Thanks a bunch, man. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Nicole, you're next up to bat. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Hi there. My name is Nicole Stratman. I am with the County of Orange Social Services Agency. I have been with the county for over 21 years now, and I'm assigned in my current assignment as the coordinator for commercially sexually exploited children's programs. And let me just kind of get right into it. I know we have a minimal amount of time, so I just want to dive right in here. And I really always start off my presentations clarifying what I will be talking about. Pretty much what we're all talking about here today is really that domestic minor sex trafficking. That is what we refer to here in the United States. Also, it's used interchangeably with commercially sexually exploited children, or we say for short CSEC. And the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, that is a federal act that indicates that if a child is engaging in a sex act for money, they are considered a victim of trafficking. So before I get further into it, I want you to just think a little bit. I know that we're on a webinar, and so you can't really participate verbally, and we're limited on time, but I really want you to sit and think about the stereotypical perceptions of somebody who might be referred to as a prostitute. Now, in many states in the United States, and certainly in California, the criminal act of prostitution is illegal for adults. So it's a criminal act, but also there are connotations that people come up with and think of often when they hear that word. In the trainings that I've done, these are some of the words that people have used when they have thought of the word prostitute. And so I just want everyone to kind of think about that and think, what is it that you've thought of? What is your perception if someone's referred to as a prostitute? Now, as a victim, I want you now to think of the term victim, not necessarily in conjunction with the term prostitute. Could be a victim of a car accident, a victim of domestic violence, but just that word victim. If someone's referred to as a victim, what types of connotations come up with someone who's referred to as a victim? Trainings that I've done, these are some of the thoughts that people shared. And you can see here, there's a pretty significant difference on the perception of someone who's referred to as a victim versus a prostitute. And this will come up again through my presentation, but I just want you to keep that in mind because language is incredibly important when we're talking regarding children in particular. So who are the victims? And Pam did speak to some of the vulnerabilities, and she's right on there. What I want to add to that is she's absolutely right about the 100% of the youth located by law enforcement that had been identified as being trafficked had some sort of involvement in the child welfare system. We had been keeping those statistics since 2014. I don't have the ones for 2020 quite yet. It's going to be, if it's not 100%, it will be 99%. That means that somewhere in the child's life, they had involvement of a child abuse investigation. It could have been one investigation, it could have been 21 investigations, or it could be that they're already part of the juvenile justice system, whether they're on probation or they're in the foster care system. And so that absolutely is a major vulnerability of children who become trafficked in particular. Also, what we also want to be aware of trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation, it's really a problem that is hidden. So while we're giving a lot of information and red flags and vulnerability information, also know that a child that you may be in contact with, you might suspect something, it's very unlikely that that child is going to identify the victimization that is happening to them. And so you need to really understand, it's, I think, our responsibility as adults, as parents, as professionals, to be able to identify those red flag signs so that we can better prevent and intervene. So I want to touch a couple of California codes. I know we have people across the United States, across the world, but I do want to touch on this so we have an understanding of what we're talking about. And prostitution, as I mentioned, is in the California Penal Code. However, we in California in 2017, the laws changed and no longer can a child be arrested for prostitution. That is actually true for 41 states in the United States and DC. 41 states and DC in the United States no longer can arrest a child for prostitution. And so we're hoping we'll get to 50 soon, but it's really important, going back to language, that we never refer to a child as a prostitute. Because if you think about what we talked about in the beginning of the presentation, the perceptions of someone who's referred to as a prostitute, how might someone then approach a child who's referred to as a prostitute versus if we recognize they're a victim of child abuse? So human trafficking of a minor, I just again want to touch on this. In California, the California Penal Code and many places have this particular law, and then the federal definition as well speaks to this, where if a child is being involved in a commercial sex act, they are automatically a victim of human trafficking. In California in particular, there's no force, fraud, coercion, or any of those kinds of things that need to be involved. It's just considered that they are a victim of human trafficking if they are involved in a commercial sex act. Now, I want to talk about the Child Abuse and Neglect Reporting Act. Again, this is California Penal Code, but you're going to find this is true across the United States and probably in many other countries. That as we learn more about commercial sexual exploitation, that it is a child abuse report. So I'm going to talk about what commercial sexual exploitation is specifically, because it's slightly different than human trafficking. It includes human trafficking, but I think that sometimes we get caught up in where's the trafficker? We got to figure out who the trafficker, who's trafficking this kid. And if there's no trafficker, there's no CSEC. And that's not true. So I really want to make sure that we understand what CSEC is. It is a child abuse report in most states, and I would recommend calling your local child abuse hotline or local law enforcement to report. So what is exploitation versus commercial sexual exploitation? The way, and this is California Penal Codes again, but the way that I sort of simplify it is that sexual exploitation is typically going to be those things that are involved child pornography, internet crimes, posting photos, sharing photos of children engaged in pornographic types of situations. That's what sexual exploitation is, or involving a child in pictorial, that type of thing. Commercial sexual exploitation is when there's a money exchange. So that includes human trafficking. Human trafficking is when a child is paid to have sex and somebody else is receiving that money. That is human trafficking. But we have a lot of kids before they get to a trafficker are finding themselves maybe running away from home that's unsafe and trying to survive out on the street. And to survive, occasionally, probably frequently, they have to exchange sex for something of value, a place to stay, transportation, food. These kinds of things we sort of refer to as survival sex. They are trying to survive, but if a child is being provided something of value for that sex specifically, that is commercial sexual exploitation. It is a child abuse report, and it's a possibility of us getting in and preventing maybe trafficking from happening or intervening where they're at with that situation. So I'm going to go much more into this in my workshop later today if you're interested. So I want to bring up this slide. and make sure that we understand what I am talking about, what my experience is. It's not labor, it's sex trafficking, it's commercial sexual exploitation of children. Doesn't look like this that you see on the screen. There is the coercion is typically the way that a trafficker or an exploiter has a child or even adult exchange sex acts for money. It is mental chains, it's not physical chains. If we're looking for physical chains, if we're looking for kids tied up, if we're looking for kids in cages, we are going to be missing what's really happening. Now, this is certainly possible. Kidnapping is not how we see human trafficking in Orange County in particular occur. So we don't want to just look for kidnapping situations, because traffickers and exploiters, they don't need to do that. And you'll learn throughout this conference that the coercion and the mental connection is what creates that bond. So this is really important. Exploiters and human traffickers, they are online. So that is where our kids are most vulnerable. Besides what we talked about in the earlier slide and the vulnerabilities that make somebody much more vulnerable, such as prior child abuse. All of our kids, though, are at risk for being exploited because they are online, especially right now. I believe there's a workshop here this weekend that talks specifically about TikTok. Brian Clevesia, the DA, is going to speak to that. And I think that's probably going to be really, really informative. So the places that our kids are spending their time is the place where they could share something where they think isn't really that big of a deal. Maybe they had a bad day, or they are upset at a parent, or maybe they're depressed and contemplating suicide, and they put that out there to the public. An exploiter or trafficker will take advantage of that and begin a grooming type of relationship. So there's dangers online for our kids if we're not talking to them, explaining to them, making sure that we know what they're doing. These are where sexual predators, traffickers, pedophiles can access our kids. And if they have additional vulnerabilities, the foster care system, prior child abuse, a home environment that feels unsafe or unwanted, it's going to raise up their possibility of being exploited or trafficked. Some kids are getting involved in sugar daddy, sugar dating type of websites where they feel like it might be a mutual exchange. Oftentimes, especially for a child, it's not. Very dangerous situations happening. Some red flag signs to consider. I just highlight a few here. A couple of them that I want to highlight. The chronic runaway truant homeless youth. Again, kids cannot survive on the streets without help from somebody. They can't rent a car, they can't rent a motel room, they need someone to help them. So that puts them in a very dangerous situation. If we have a homeless youth that maybe is going to a known safe environment, maybe they always run to a best friend's house, or they always run away to the other parent's house. That's slightly different. We really want to know when a child is run away, where are they going, if anywhere? Inconsistencies in stories when you're talking to a child, and then either they have someone with them, or we've had some cases where we have kids who are under 18 years old show up and they have nobody with them. And that doesn't make sense, to have nobody with them. So things that don't make sense. So there really is sort of a continuum of vulnerabilities. Of child sexual abuse is the most common type of child abuse that is a continuum into becoming a victim of trafficking in particular. But there's all of these things that go into play throughout a child's life with the vulnerabilities that can put them on the path of being exploited and trafficked. So if we can understand and see some of these things, and I know Pam will be talking about some of that in her workshop with ACEs, which is excellent to really understand that this is a continuum that we need to be aware of. So the next slide here is going to be quotes from youth who have been trafficked. Again, somebody with an identified trafficker, which is under the umbrella of commercial sexual exploitation, but now we have a trafficker involved. These are kids who were located by law enforcement, interviewed by a social worker, and these are the things that they said was happening to them. Okay, so you can see the extreme quotes that are being said. Again, these are kids that are now trafficked. We want to be able to pay attention and know the first time a child might have sold a picture of themselves to somebody online and intervene before they're saying something like, he choked me and threw me against a wall and hit my eye, before they're just trying to figure out a way to survive on the street at 14 years old. So we want to really pay attention to these. That's why these kinds of conferences and trainings are so important, to get to kids before they're saying this type of stuff. So quickly, I want to, before I finish up, what does prevention look like? Pam talked about, some of it in schools, and it really is about educating, awareness, healthy relationships, teaching kids what healthy relationships are, knowing what our target population is, which we talked about, the most vulnerable, the ones with minimal support systems, but also kids that are spending time online. I've really highlighted that more and more because of COVID, because the amount of time that the kids are online these days. Ending the demand is part of prevention as well. So what's the one thing, though, that you can do right now, besides advocating for bringing education into your schools and prevention into your schools and any other place that you work, and understanding this population? The one thing you can do right now is you can be a safe and stable adult in a child's life. That is the one thing. You don't need anything else. You just have an identified child, whether it's your own child that you want to make sure feels safe and secure, or whether it's a relative, or maybe it's a neighbor child, or maybe you're a teacher or a therapist, that you are that safe, stable adult in a child's life. So should they get into a situation that is exploitation, sexual exploitation, or trafficking, maybe they'll come to you. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for your insights and your time. Let's move to Dr. Corey Rude.
Okay, guys, I'm Dr. Rude. I will not belabor the intro. Basically, I'm a child abuse pediatrician and the medical director of child abuse pediatrics at UCI, and work closely with our task force here in Orange County, and closely with Pam and Nicole. I want to emphasize for all of you who are listening the importance of your medical professionals in addressing the needs of survivors of human trafficking and CSEC, and particularly in these minors. We know from a medical perspective that children are a product of not only their biology and their genetics, but their home environments, their school environments, their community environments that really build and nurture that child into who they become. So understand that from a pediatric perspective, childhood development is based on as much environment as it is nature or genetics. So in understanding that, right, we often talk about stress, we talk about adverse childhood experiences. And the reason we do that is because there's more and more understanding and more emphasis on the terrible health outcomes and societal outcomes that spawn from toxic stress and these adverse childhood experiences. And this plays directly into how exploitation and trafficking affect youth, affect minors, because they have malleable brains, they have malleable development, and you inject significant trauma like CSEC and trafficking into that development, and you're going to deal with significant behavioral, psychological, and health outcomes that are often overlooked or labeled as other things. We know from research, numerous studies all over the world, that child maltreatment has a significant physiologic and anatomic effect on developing brains. And we know that the brain is not fully developed until well into the mid-20s, so into adulthood. So that effect can have, unfortunately, detrimental impacts on brain development, that effect of trauma, all throughout childhood into adolescence and even early adulthood. We know that adverse childhood experiences are an issue, and there will be a great workshop later to focus on that. But keep in mind that there have been studies looking at homeless youth who are exploited, and you can see that the numbers of adverse childhood experiences in our base population compared to homeless youth who are exploited continues to climb, right? So if your homeless youth who is exploited has an average ACE score of 6 out of 10, right? Once we understand what ACEs do, we have a significant concern that these children have an underlying score that's already high, and then we're adding to it with more trauma. So who are these children? Both Pam and Nicole mentioned who these most vulnerable populations are in our youth. From my perspective, all the youth and all the children I see in our child abuse clinics at our Children's Advocacy Center here in Orange County are on this list, right? Because they're all potential or alleged victims of sex abuse, physical abuse, neglect, or involved with the child welfare system. So they're already on this list, and may have multiple characteristics on this list. They may have dealt with poverty or homelessness in their past. They may identify as LGBTQ. They may have a mental health diagnosis. They may be, a displaced person, or, an immigrant, an asylum seeker. So understand that these are vulnerabilities, and these vulnerabilities add up to place children at incredible risk for targeting by these exploiters and these traffickers through various means. One of those means, as Nicole mentioned, is online, which we see all too frequently. And there's plenty of data to back all of that up, which I will not go through, but there's plenty of research to show us what sort of characteristics our trafficked youth have from their childhood. And one of those is child maltreatment, a child maltreatment history. Much like intimate partner violence, we know that this wheel of power and control that includes so much violence and manipulation has an incredible detrimental effect on children. And I was speaking to a group just the other day. We think of the intimate partner violent correlation. And in intimate partner violence, there's two individuals. When we think about exploitation and trafficking, we have to spread that net of power and control even further, because these kids are not only abused and assaulted by their potential trafficker, but they're being abused and assaulted by buyers. They're being abused and assaulted by complete strangers out on the street, and they're being abused and assaulted by other victims as well. So keep in mind that their network of abuse, assault, and what this wheel looks like for them may be much broader or more complex than we may think when we think of intimate partner violence. Nicole mentioned, this control and manipulation, very, very concerning when it comes to minors, because they are so manipulable and they are so malleable to attention and love and affection that you don't need the chains, the physical restraints. It can all be psychological. And that from a pediatric perspective, that this nurturing is such an integral part of their development and their growth. It is no surprise that traffickers and exploiters use this to keep these youth under their control and afraid of going to the police or going to social services or going to an individual for help. But what about the medicine? The medicine is important because so many of these youth are not seen. When we label them as trafficked youth or sexually exploited youth, we often overlook the fact that they are sexually abused youth, right? And as Nicole showed, there is a gradient scale of what sexual abuse umbrella victimization looks like. When we think of what sexual abuse or an acute sexual assault, a rape, looks like, and then we think of what sexual exploitation or trafficking looks like, we don't often see them as the same thing. But from a medical perspective, they are incredibly similar. So engaging our medical community, our clinics and our emergency rooms and our sexual response teams, our sexual assault response teams, our forensic nurses, our child abuse teams in recognizing and responding to sexually exploited and trafficked youth as sexually abused and assaulted youth is incredibly important, because the medical interventions are incredibly similar. And in fact, they may even be more robust for our exploited and trafficked youth. You can see here from a published article by the Global Centurion, Laura Lederer and her group. They are attorneys and they are a nonprofit. But their publication in 2014 that these were adult female victims of sex trafficking were experiencing these high rates of sexual victimization and other medical outcomes was a surprise to the medical community, because we didn't know that we should be asking about this. In fact, when they asked these survivors, did you ever seek medical attention while you were being victimized? 88% of them said yes, I went in for medical attention. And these are the locations they most often frequented. We know they go into the emergency rooms now, but back then, just 7 years ago, we weren't realizing that. 65% of these women said they were going in for birth control and they were going in alone. That's significant. That's a prime opportunity for your medical provider, the nurse, the medical staff, to ask questions about safety, about violence, about sexual practices, and open that dialogue. Because as Pam said, kids, youth, they trust nurses, they trust the medical environment to attend to the needs of their bodies, and they often put aside the lies and the fabrications that they would otherwise use with the system to be able to give honest report about their bodies, because they want honest and accurate treatment to address their needs. As a medical profession, we started doing our own studies, asking survivors, this is adults and youth of sex and labor trafficking, did you go in for medical attention? 65% of these survivors in this study said, yes, I went in. So what are they coming in with? They're coming in with physical trauma because they're being physically assaulted day in and day out, much like intimate partner violence. They're coming in with reproductive trauma and sexual health questions, sexually transmitted infections, pregnancy, genital and anal trauma, breast trauma. And they're coming in so many ways with mental health crises that we often see as other things. They're coming in with suicidality. They're coming in with ingestions or intoxications. They're coming in with traumatic stress manifestations through anxiety, behaviors, lashing out, this externalization of symptoms, all based in trauma. So we want to educate the community, but we also want to educate our medical providers that these youth and these kids are having significant medical outcomes from their victimization, and we cannot mislabel that or misrepresent to them what this is and to the community, because inevitably the health outcomes will only worsen if we don't recognize and address them. So what can we do? Understand, as medical teams, especially those who work in sexual assault response or child maltreatment response, we can do a lot. And what I tell our teams is that we can empower. We can empower youth and children that they are healthy, that their bodies are healthy, that they are normal, that although they've been a victim of all of these things, that their body is resilient, that their mind is resilient. We can answer questions about sexually transmitted infections. We can test for things like HIV and pregnancy. We can even prevent them if they come in an acute time frame. So there's so much we can do to empower. And I just want to debunk the myth that a medical exam after a sexual assault or sexual exploitation can be re-traumatizing. that myth has been debunked by many of my colleagues. And there are publications out there showing that actually victims and survivors are very appreciative of the options they are given, and that they appreciate when they can accept or refuse a medical exam or testing, knowing that in the future they may be able to take up that offer. So there's so much we can do. There's plenty of evidence to support that your medical providers can be a fantastic asset if they are educated and if they know how to correlate their expertise with the task force, with the teachers, with the other community advocates and providers who are working in this anti-trafficking effort. So in summary, I just advocate that in your collaborations, wherever you are, that you engage with your medical community, to include them on your task forces, to include them on your committees, engage with your school nurses, like Pam has said. There are so many frontline persons, especially in the medical community, who are seeing these kids. And if they can recognize the red flags and the vulnerabilities and ask a few questions, they may be able to pick up on more kids and even do some quality prevention.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Yeah.
So if I can impose on you to stay an extra 5 minutes, panelists, so we can make sure, because our time was a little off at the beginning. We do have some questions I'd like to get to. Probably the first question I was hoping to kind of throw at the panel was a question that one of our audience gave. Is basically over the past year, we've been hearing reports of increased domestic violence and child abuse due to forced, isolation in the home because of the COVID restrictions that we've been experiencing. What strategies from the education or social services systems in OC have been implemented? And I guess the first part of it would be, are those accurate, right? Are those accurate assessments that have really been happening? And number two, what are some strategies that can be used to address those situations happening? And Dr. Root, I'm going to start with you, because we had this discussion just before we started the panel, because I'd asked myself, what are you seeing in your practices, in Miller's Children's Hospital and things like that? And we'll start with you. And we'll go to Nicole
very briefly, from a medical standpoint, there's a lot of research out there right now to answer this very question. We don't like to just speculate, so we do like to get the numbers and support that. I can say that we are running research right now in LA County and Orange County to really look at how the numbers compare to medical severity and exams. But I can say anecdotally from our Children's Advocacy Center, although our interviews have decreased because we have fewer people coming in and fewer people reporting, our medical exams have gone up by about 25%. So there's a definite disconnect there. And our concern is that even though reporting numbers may have gone down, that those being reported have a higher percentage of physical exam needs. And therefore there's a correlation there maybe with severity. We'll see.
Okay. And so, and I mentioned too, with my experience with law enforcement, I always dreaded the times when family get together, during Easter, during Thanksgiving, during Christmas, during New Year's, because that was the time we got the calls for domestic violence, child abuse, because the whole family would get together. And frequently people getting together and staying together over extended period of times who weren't used to it. And if they don't get along, they don't know how to get along, they don't have coping strategies, and someone would get hurt historically. But let me go to Nicole. What has your experience in your capacity?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's true, the calls into the child abuse hotline have gone down significantly due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The calls with regard to allegations of commercial sexual exploitation have gone up. The number of kids that we do see that we need to intervene upon, whether it's regular, whether it's what we normally perceive as child abuse, along with commercial sexual exploitation, it's more severe. And so there is a major concern there regarding reporting and intervening and being able to identify those kids, certainly.
Wow. And Pam, what have you seen? Because I mean, you're the RN on the scene, right? In many ways, even though kids have been going through Zoom or other media, to go to school, they're slowly trickling back, obviously, into classrooms as well. So what have you been saying?
Well, as Nicole said, we know that, and I've talked with Dr. Ann Light, who is the head of the medical director of the Social Service Agency, and we know that one of the reasons that child abuse reports are going down is because many of the reports come in from the school system. We get to see the children every day. We're very familiar with them, so we've lost that opportunity to intervene. So hopefully once school comes back in, and with Governor Newsom's incentivization and the vaccines, et cetera, hopefully we'll be back in session sooner rather than later. That will allow us to keep more eyes on our usual vigilance, which teachers are very good at watching and understanding their students and what their needs are. And additionally, as I said, it was sort of timely when I said we hired those 7 managers to go out to various districts and connect with them regarding mental health services. When we hired them, we did not know COVID was coming, but sometimes things dovetail. And so we have that program ready to go. And we're already incorporating it with some kids that are back on campus. And, Zoom, when we know there's problems, but that's pretty hard to detect right now. We're really behind the 8 ball with kids not being at school, but that should change soon. And then we'll be able to get eyes on them and get them help and intervene when we can, early and often. And we're acutely aware in the educational system of how much depression and anxiety has increased over the years. So all of us have eyes on that and creating strategies to help with that and educate staff on how to help with that.
So is it safe for me to say that while the reports have decreased, the severity of the situations that have been discovered have increased, whether it's CSEC or child abuse? Is that a safe summary of what you just said?
That's our concern, and
Right.
the preliminary data seems to point in that direction. And I think we just need to get all of the data and really analyze it to see if that's the accurate conclusion. Yeah.
Fair enough. And just so you know, in my contact with task forces around the country, the idea has been that the actual incidence of human trafficking has increased. That the limitations placed on stay-at-home orders and social distancing don't impact traffickers at all. The business as usual, right? That doesn't slow down people who are doing illicit trade at all. So while families are behaving appropriately, the criminal world doesn't really care. They're doing business as usual, right? So, and unfortunately, that affects our children as well if they're pulled into that world. Now, we've had many questions regarding educational responses to domestic violence and child abuse. And obviously, the strategies involve reporting, involve intervention. How do we intervene with our students in domestic violence, which is largely a criminal enterprise in some ways? But what are our strategies for intervention once we have access to the students again and can readily identify and be a part of that? I'll start with you, Pam, and we'll go to Nicole after that.
Yeah, one of the programs that we are moving forward with is called, we don't have an official title for it yet, but it's called CARE, and it's going to be a link between, and we're going to pilot it, but I think this will be very helpful. We're going to link between the educational system and the police departments in certain cities. So if a child is in a home where there has been an incident of violence, the police are going to be able to, the law enforcement will be able to connect with the school. They don't necessarily give us details due to privacy laws, but they'll say, hey, extra care for, John Smith and Mrs. Brown's class today. And we don't necessarily know what happened, but we know there needs to be a little extra eyes on that child and a little more watchful for them. So we're starting piloting that fairly soon. And additionally, we do have school resource officers that are connected with their police departments and oftentimes know things that are going on. Sometimes, unfortunately, there's a disconnect between, there's the dog, it's inevitable. Sometimes there's a disconnect between law enforcement and the schools, and we don't often know. So hopefully this program that we're going to be piloting will be an avenue that will help increase connection and allow for more intervention.
Thank you. And Nicole?
Yes, as far as it goes for intervention or prevention in schools, part of the Healthy Families Act does require prevention curriculum in schools. Every school district is really handling it different. So whatever school district that you're a part of, you can advocate there for bringing in a prevention curriculum. There's a few different kinds out there. I can tell you the Orange County Human Trafficking Task Force is working with a specific organization called Higher Ground and the Anaheim Union High School District to bring a more rich prevention curriculum into that school. So there's lots of efforts being done across Orange County and across the United States on prevention, which is really at that junior high school level, as well as Pam was mentioning, making sure that reports are being filed with the proper authorities, whether it's law enforcement or child protective services.
Thank you, Nicole. And Dr. Ruud, do you have any comments as far as, the interventions you can provide from in the medical profession when you identify people potentially victims of child abuse and or domestic violence?
Yeah, I mean, there are many ways in which your medical professionals can intervene. I think in prevention, your primary care providers can offer not only instruction to their families, especially those families where there are risk factors or they have screened positive for intimate partner violence, getting them resources, making the appropriate mandated reports to Child Protective Services. From a child maltreatment standpoint, when we recognize or diagnose that a child has been a victim of any form of child maltreatment, connecting those children with services through victim advocate resources here in Orange County, through groups like Waymakers, through Child Protective Services, Social Services Agency, through their schools. Those resources, again, are going to mitigate the effects of that trauma and those ACEs. And the sooner we can intervene for those kids, right, to help mitigate the downstream causes or downstream effects of the trauma, the less likely those kids will be vulnerable to exploitation in the future. So really jumping in and getting them resources and connections in safe places is crucial. The earlier, the better.
Thank you, Dr. And so I want to be respectful of your time because we've already gone 5 minutes over. We have other things going on in breaks. So we will answer other questions. I'll throw those to the panelists if you can have some time later to provide some answers in general. I want to thank you all for taking the time today. I want to thank our audience for taking the extra time to stay with us and answer these questions. I'd like to move forward onto the next panel that we have. And again, thank you again for participating in Ensure Justice 2021. Look forward to seeing you in future plenaries. Have a good time. Bye-bye now.